before the first laugh ever echoed through the reef, before a clarinet's notes drifted through the kelp forests, before even the idea of a pineapple house sitting neatly on the ocean floor, there was silence. The seabed lay untouched, endless and still, as though time itself had not yet begun to stir beneath the waves. No footprints marked the sand. No shells had been gathered into piles. No bubbles rose toward the surface, carrying the sounds of speech or music or play. There was only water flowing gently, carrying with it the rhythm of eternity. This silence was not empty, but full of possibility. It was the kind of silence that comes before a story begins, the hush before the curtain lifts, the calm before life writes its first chapter. The ocean, in its vastness, was dreaming, and those dreams were patient. The sea moved in long, slow breaths. The currents swept across the sandy plains, brushing them smooth like an artist preparing a canvas. Tiny motes of light drifted in the depths, glowing plankton scattered like distant stars. The deep trenches yawned like sleeping giants, their shadows stretching forever into the unknown. All around, the world beneath the waves waited, perfectly still, for something to awaken. Legends say that it was during this time, this age before the first citizen, that the sea held its greatest secret. It dreamed not of creatures alone, but of a community, a place where stories could be told, where laughter could ripple like bubbles, where quiet could turn into comfort instead of emptiness. And in that dream, the very first outlines of what would one day be called Bikini Bottom began to take shape. The sand itself seemed to whisper. Each grain shifted ever so slightly, as though guided by a hidden hand, forming gentle ridges that resembled roads. Coral began to sprout in patterns that looked like towers, symmetrical and organized, far more deliberate than simple growth. Some say the coral rose in spirals because the ocean wanted streets, places where currents could weave and citizens could wander. Others believe the coral grew this way to mark sacred places, lines of energy where the sea's dream felt strongest. Above, the moon watched, its pale glow sinking through the surface, silvering the water. One night, the moon shed a single tear, a glowing pearl, and it drifted down, down, down into the deepest part of the waiting sea. It landed softly upon the sand, nestling into an oyster shell that had opened just at the right moment. The pearl glowed faintly, its light steady and calm, brighter than the plankton, gentler than the stars. The seabed that had once been cloaked in shadow now shimmered with a subtle warmth. It was a light that did not chase away the dark, but embraced it, softening the edges, making the ocean floor feel less like a void and more like a home. From every corner of the sea, creatures stirred. They were not yet the kind we know, the lively sponges, the clever squirrels, the joyful starfish. These were ancient beings, born of silence and patience. Tiny jellyfish floated toward the pearl, their bodies pulsing softly as though answering a call. Crabs scuttled closer, cautious but curious. Even the currents shifted, as though the water itself leaned in to see what had arrived. The pearl's glow lasted through the ages, and in its radiance, the very first gathering began. Not yet a town, not yet a community, but a feeling, a circle of life forming around a single point of light. And so what we now call Bikini Bottom was not born in chaos or noise. It was born in stillness. It was born in patience. It was born in the soft, glowing heart of a dream that belonged to the ocean itself. The trenches surrounding this place seemed to lean inward as though listening. The coral grew taller, bending toward the glow. The sand smoothed itself again and again, sculpted by invisible hands until it resembled a wide, open plain, Something was taking shape here, something intentional. The ocean does not hurry. Its tides move at their own rhythm. And so the shaping of Bikini Bottom was not a sudden event. It was slow, like the rise of a shell from the seabed, or the drifting of kelp across the currents. Every detail was placed with care. A cave carved into the side of a rock, a line of shells scattered in a spiral, a faint humming from the deep, so soft it could only be heard by those who closed their eyes. This was the beginning before the beginning, a time when the sea itself was the only storyteller, and its story was told not with words, but with shapes, patterns, and light. Even now, some say you can feel it. If you sit quietly in Bikini Bottom, when the currents have slowed and the jellyfish have settled into their fields, you might sense the silence that came first. A silence so deep it feels alive, carrying the memory of a pearl, a dream, and a promise. And though so much has changed, the laughter of SpongeBob, the music of Squidward, the adventures of Sandy, beneath it all, the silent beginning still lingers, whispering through the sand and the coral, reminding us that every place has its origin, and every origin begins in stillness. The pearl rested in its oyster shell, quiet but alive, glowing as if it carried the heartbeat of the sea itself. Around it, time moved differently. Days and nights passed in their eternal rhythm above the surface. But here beneath the waves there was only the steady drift of currents and the gentle hush of silence. The ocean floor seemed to lean closer, as though every grain of sand wished to feel the warmth of the pearl. The glow spread outward slowly, touching coral, kelp, and stone. Wherever the light reached, change followed. Coral that had once grown wild and uneven began to bloom in graceful curves, archways rising naturally as though shaped by an unseen architect. Kelp swayed in wider circles, tracing the edges of invisible roads. The seabed was no longer an endless plain. It was becoming a place of gathering, though no one had planned it. The sea itself was the builder. The first creatures to notice this transformation were the drifting jellyfish. They floated from far-off waters, their bodies pulsing in the rhythm of the tides. To them, the pearl was like a star resting on the ocean floor. They circled it slowly, their tendrils glowing faintly in response, as if greeting an old friend they had been waiting for all along. Some say that these jellyfish became the first guardians of the place that would one day be Bikini Bottom. They carried light within them, and the pearl gave them purpose, to keep watch. Crabs arrived next. Their shells clicked softly as they scuttled across the sand, their pincers brushing against small stones. At first they approached with caution, watching the jellyfish with curious eyes. But soon they too felt the pull of the pearl. They gathered around it in silent reverence, forming small circles, their bodies like stones set into the sand. They dug tiny hollows near the glow, as if preparing for the homes that would one day stand here. Above them, schools of fish swam past, pausing to glance down at the light. They did not stay, but they carried the sight of the glowing seabed to distant waters. Slowly, whispers of this strange, shining place spread through the currents. Far-off creatures, curious and weary, began to follow the trail of rumor and tide, drifting closer, always closer, to the pearl at the heart of the ocean's dream. It is said that even the water itself began to change. The currents grew softer here, calmer, as though the sea did not wish to disturb its own creation. Bubbles rose more gently and the water grew warmer, wrapping every creature who entered in a quiet embrace. This was no longer simply a part of the ocean floor. This was something new, something set apart. At night, when the moonlight touched the surface above, The pearl would glow more brightly, as if answering the silver light from above. Some of the oldest legends claim that this glow was not only for the sea creatures, it reached up to the world beyond, sending a shimmer of light into the starlit sky. Perhaps that is why sailors, long before maps and compasses, sometimes spoke of strange lights beneath the waves, guiding them across the dark waters. But beneath, in the silent depths, the glow meant something different. It meant safety. It meant belonging. It meant that the seabed, once empty, was no longer alone. Slowly, the ocean dream gave shape to landmarks. A ridge of stone curved in a perfect arc, forming what looked like a natural amphitheater, as though the sea already imagined songs and voices filling it. Hollow caves opened in the side of rocks, their entrances smooth and round like doors carved by careful hands. Even the sand seemed to form patterns, spirals and circles, that looked less like accidents of the tide and more like designs. These were not yet homes. They were not yet streets, but they were the foundations, drawn not by builders, but by the sea itself. It is strange to think of a town without citizens, but for a long time that is what Bikini Bottom was. A place waiting for life to arrive. An empty stage glowing softly, silent yet alive with the possibility. Perhaps the sea was patient because it knew what was to come. Or perhaps it was simply dreaming without hurry, content to imagine the outlines before filling them in. Either way, the seabed continued to change in small, steady ways. The jellyfish would drift through the arches of coral, brushing their tendrils along the stone as though blessing it. The crabs kept their hollows clean, polishing the sand with their claws. Sometimes at the edge of the glow, shadows of larger creatures would appear, turtles with shells worn smooth by time, manta rays gliding like whispers across the water. They did not stay, but their presence seemed to acknowledge the pearl's quiet power. And all the while the pearl glowed. It never dimmed, never faded, as though its light was drawn from the very heart of the ocean itself. Even in this age of beginning, stories were already forming. The jellyfish told one another in their silent pulses that the pearl was a gift from the moon, dropped into the water as a promise. The crabs believed it had risen from the seabed itself, a treasure born from the earth below. The fish whispered that it was a seed, waiting to grow into something greater than any of them could imagine. None of them were wrong, for the pearl was not just an object. It was a story waiting to be told. And so the silent beginning stretched on, not in haste, but in peace. The seabed glowed softly. The creatures gathered quietly. The ocean dreamed patiently. Oh, what would one day become? Streets and homes, laughter and voices, first existed only as stillness and light. And in that stillness, the foundation of Bikini Bottom was set, steady, calm, and eternal. The ocean is patient. It does not rush, and it does not forget. Long after the pearl had settled into its shell, long after the jellyfish had circled and the crabs had dug their hollows, the sea continued to dream. Each current that passed carried a fragment of that dream, weaving through the trenches, brushing across the coral, and whispering into the ears of every creature that drifted near. Some days, the seabed lay in near-perfect silence, broken only by the hum of water sliding across sand. Other days, faint tremors from the surface, storms perhaps, or shifting winds above sent ripples down, shaking the glowing pearl ever so slightly. But nothing disturbed its light. Nothing broke the stillness of its presence. The pearl was constant, and constancy is what the sea cherished most. Over time, the glow seeped deeper into the seabed. The sand, once pale and ordinary, took on a faint shimmer, as though tiny crystals had been sprinkled across it. At night, the ground glowed just enough to reveal outlines, soft paths stretching outward from the pearl, like spokes of a wheel. These were not yet true roads, not yet traveled, but they hinted at the movement of feet and fins to come. The coral continued its strange, deliberate growth. Some sprouted in tall columns, others bent gracefully like archways. A few even curved toward one another, forming what looked like doorways to homes that did not yet exist. The sea was sketching with coral, drawing lines of possibility, testing shapes as though it were both artist and architect. The jellyfish drifted through these coral arches, pulsing softly, tracing invisible circles in the water. Sometimes they would gather at the pearl, floating in a halo of light, their tendrils glowing faintly in unison. To those who watched, it was as if the jellyfish were praying, or perhaps remembering something ancient that no one else could understand. The crabs, too, played their part. Though they were small, their endless scuttling shaped the sand. Each hollow they dug seemed to fall into place perfectly, lining up with the glowing paths that stretched from the pearl. Slowly, without realizing, the crabs traced the beginnings of a plaza, a central space around which life might one day gather. And then there were the fish. They did not settle, not yet. They came and went in schools, silver bodies flashing like mirrors in the pearl's glow. But in their movement, they carried the story farther and farther, whispering through the sea that something new had begun in the deep. Some schools returned again and again, their circles growing tighter each time, as though the pull of the pearl was too strong to ignore. Legends say that even the whales knew of the silent beginning. Once in a great while, a whale would pass through the outer edges of the glowing seabed, its massive shadow stretching across the sand. The pearl's light glimmered faintly on its skin, and the whale would pause, hovering in the current, before slowly moving on. Perhaps it understood that this place was not yet ready. Perhaps it recognized that the ocean was shaping something fragile, and that its presence was only meant to bless it from afar. The trenches surrounding the seabed grew darker in contrast to the glow. Some creatures feared them, believing shadows gathered there with hungry patience. Others believed the darkness was sacred, a boundary protecting the pearl's light, keeping it safe from whatever lay beyond. And so the early creatures stayed close, never straying too far, always circling back to the glow. The nights grew longer, or perhaps they only felt that way. Time in the silent beginning did not move as we understand it. A single night could feel like an age, and 1,000 tides could pass as gently as a single breath. In this timelessness, the sea was free to dream without interruption. It dreamed of voices. It dreamed of songs. It dreamed of laughter bubbling upward, filling the water with warmth. And though those dreams had not yet come true, the pearl's glow seemed to hold the promise of them, as though every flicker of light was a note of music waiting to be played. The coral continued to rise. Some formations looked like towers, others like bridges. A few curved into spirals so intricate they seemed more like works of art than accidents of nature. To the creatures that gathered there, it was as though the sea were building a stage, piece by piece, for a story that had not yet begun. The jellyfish glowed brighter in these spirals. They drifted in patterns that mirrored the coral, tracing shapes in the water that no eye could fully capture. Their movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. If the pearl was the heart of the silent beginning, the jellyfish were its dancers, telling its story in silence and light. Still, no voices spoke, no songs echoed, no laughter bubbled upward. It was not yet time. The ocean was not finished dreaming. Even now, if you imagine yourself sinking slowly into the deep, you might feel it. The stillness, the calm, the patient weight of silence. You might see the pearl resting in its shell, glowing faintly in the dark. You might notice the arches of coral, the soft shimmer of sand, the shadows of jellyfish drifting past. And in that moment, you might understand what the first creatures felt, that this place was not empty, that silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes silence is fullness. Sometimes silence is the beginning. This was how the seabed prepared itself quietly, patiently, without haste, without noise. And so the silent beginning stretched onward. A place not yet awake, but no longer asleep. A dream halfway to becoming real. The ocean's patience is endless. It waits through countless tides, shaping the world one ripple at a time. And in the silent beginning, this patience was everything. The pearl glowed, the coral grew, the sand shimmered faintly, and the creatures circled in quiet harmony. Time did not hurry here. It unfolded like a long, unbroken wave, smooth and steady, with no end in sight. Each night the moon rose above the surface, sending its silver glow down into the depths. The pearl answered with its own light, brighter, warmer, softer, as though speaking in a secret language only the sea could understand. When moonlight and pearl light touched, the seabed shimmered like glass, and the creatures paused in reverence. The jellyfish pulsed slower. The crabs ceased their endless scuttling. Even the schools of fish hovered in stillness, suspended in the water like 1,000 tiny stars. It was as though the ocean itself stopped to breathe. The trenches that framed this place grew deeper, darker, heavier with shadow. The creatures knew better than to venture too far into them. They kept to the glow, to the calm, to the promise of safety. Yet even the darkness had its place in the silent beginning. Without it, the light of the pearl would have been meaningless. The shadows gave it depth. The silence gave it song. The vast unknown gave the small seabed its importance. And so both light and darkness belonged here. Both silence and dream had their place. The seabed was balanced, poised on the edge of becoming. As more tides passed, the seabed revealed subtle changes. The coral spirals grew taller, archways widened, and the hollowed caves looked more and more like doorways awaiting guests. The pearl's glow seemed to stretch farther, carrying warmth into the sand. Some creatures swore they saw faint patterns etched into the ground, lines and curves too precise to be natural, as if the seabed itself was carving maps. The jellyfish followed these lines with gentle precision. They floated slowly along the glowing paths, tracing every curve, every spiral, until they returned again to the pearl. Their pulsing glow reflected the shape of the seabed as it grew more complex, like a dance choreographed by the ocean itself. The crabs deepened their hollows, pushing sand outward until small mounds rose around the central glow. These mounds, though simple, resembled the foundations of walls. The crabs did not know they were building, but the sea did. The sea was guiding every claw, every grain, every hollow. And so, little by little, what had once been empty began to resemble a village, though no one had named it yet, and no one had claimed it. It was still a dream, but dreams were growing stronger. The fish that circled brought more than whispers now. They brought shells, shiny stones, and scraps of seaweed from distant waters. They left them near the pearl as though making offerings. Perhaps they sensed the sacredness of the place. Perhaps they only wished to be part of it. Either way, the seabed began to fill not only with coral and sand, but with gifts from the wider ocean. And then one night, something new happened. The pearl pulsed. Just once, bright, then dim, then bright again. The creatures froze, their movements halting as they turned toward the glow. The jellyfish circled closer. The crabs pressed themselves into the sand. The fish clustered in tight schools. The pearl pulsed again. Its light rippled outward in waves, brushing against every shell, every grain, every coral branch. The seabed glowed as though alive, every part of it breathing together. For a moment, silence was not silence at all. It was presence. It was connection. It was the ocean itself saying, yes, this is the beginning. The pulse faded. The pearl returned to its steady glow. But from that night onward, the creatures carried a new awareness. They were not simply wandering. They were not simply gathering. They were part of something greater, something unfolding, something that would one day become a town, a home, a place of stories. And though none of them could speak it aloud, each felt the truth in their quiet way. The jellyfish glowed a little brighter. The crabs built a little deeper. The fish circled a little closer. And the pearl, silent and constant, continued to shine. The silent beginning lingered like this for an age. No voices yet, no laughter, no music. But the stage was ready. The canvas was painted. The outlines were drawn. All that remained was for the sea's dream to take its final form. Even now, if you wander Bikini Bottom at night, when the streets are empty and the town is hushed, you may feel a trace of it. You may sense the silence beneath the sound, the stillness beneath the laughter. You may notice the way the sand glimmers faintly under the moon, or the way the coral arches seem to lean as though remembering something older than memory. For the silent beginning never ended. It lingers quietly in every bubble, every ripple, every stone. It whispers through the jellyfish fields. It hums in the coral caves. It rests beneath the foundations of every home. Before the voices, there was silence. Before the songs, there was stillness. Before the town, there was the pearl. And the pearl remains. The silent beginning is not gone. It is only hidden, waiting to be felt by those who pause long enough to listen. And so the ocean's dream was ready. The seabed was prepared. The story could finally begin. The pearl glowed steadily in its oyster cradle, a quiet beacon in the endless blue. For a long time, it had been only the pearl, the coral, the sand, and the patient silence of the ocean. But no dream stays silent forever. The ocean, vast and eternal, had whispered for ages, and now its whispers began to take shape. The first citizens of the deep were not like those who walk the streets of Bikini Bottom today. They were not sponges with laughter in their voices, nor squids with clarinets, nor cheerful starfish. They were older, stranger, born from the stillness of the sea itself. These early dwellers belonged to the ocean's ancient rhythm, creatures shaped by patience, silence, and light. The first to gather were the jellyfish. Drawn by the glow of the pearl, they drifted slowly from distant waters, their translucent bodies pulsing with a soft light. They were larger then, older and slower, their tendrils long and sweeping like veils of silver. To them, the pearl was not just a light, but a voice, a call echoing through the waters. They circled it in wide, graceful patterns, their movements so even and calm that it seemed they were performing an eternal dance. The jellyfish did not speak with the words. They spoke with pulses, faint waves of light that rippled through their bodies. When one pulsed, the others answered, and soon the seabed shimmered with their silent conversation. Perhaps they were telling stories of the pearl, or perhaps they were simply greeting one another after long journeys. Whatever their language, it filled the empty ocean with presence, a soft and living hum. After the jellyfish came the turtles. Slow and deliberate, they glided down from the higher waters, their shells broad and ancient, marked with ridges carved by time. They settled near the coral arches, resting their heavy bodies on the sand. Their eyes were deep and unhurried, as though they carried the memories of tides long past. Unlike the jellyfish, they did not circle or glow. They simply stayed, calm and grounded, as though anchoring the seabed with their steady presence. The crabs were already there, of course. They had never left the pearl's side since it first appeared. But with the arrival of the turtles and the jellyfish, the crabs began to move differently. They scuttled in patterns, arranging shells in neat spirals, digging hollows in careful circles, as if they suddenly knew they were not alone. For the first time, the seabed felt like a gathering, not just a dream. Then came the schools of fish. They did not stay long at first. They moved in shimmering waves, hundreds at a time, flashing silver in the pearl's glow. They swam through the coral arches, darted between the jellyfish, circled the turtles, and scattered into the darkness again. But they always returned. They brought motion, playfulness, a spark of energy that stirred the stillness. Some say the fish carried with them the first laughter of the ocean, not yet voiced, but hinted in the way they spun and flickered like sparks in water. Others followed, star-shaped beings that drifted gently across the sand, curling their arms into spirals as they rested. Small eels that wove through the coral arches like ribbons of shadow. Even great rays, wide as the seabed itself, glided past, casting fleeting silhouettes over the pearl. Each one, in its own way, answered the ocean's dream. Each one added its presence to the gathering. And so the silent beginning shifted. It was no longer just silence and light. It was community. Still unformed, still wordless, but alive. The jellyfish gathered each night, their pulses glowing brighter beneath the moon's reflection. Some say they were the first historians of the deep, recording the ocean's memory and patterns of light. The turtles became the guardians of rest, teaching the others patience by simply being still. The crabs carved and shaped, their claws leaving marks in the sand that others began to follow. And the fish filled the seabed with movement, with wonder, with the promise of joy. It is said that the first true circle of citizens happened by chance. The jellyfish drifted inward, the turtles settled near the coral, the crabs formed their spirals, and the fish swam above them. Without planning, without words, they created the shape of a community around the pearl. The seabed glowed brighter that night, as if the ocean itself was pleased. And though these first citizens did not speak, their presence told a story of gathering, a story of belonging. A story of a home that was beginning to form, not in walls or houses, but in the spaces between them. This was the first heart of Bikini Bottom. Not buildings, not names, not streets. It was the creatures themselves, gathering in silence, guided by a pearl, breathing the ocean's dream into life. Life in the silent beginning was gentle, measured, and quiet. The first citizens of the deep had no need for words and no need for the noise of hurried voices. Their language was the rhythm of currents, the shimmer of light, the slow patterns of movement. Every gesture, every ripple in the water carried meaning. The jellyfish, with their luminous pulses, became the first storytellers. Each night, when the pearl's glow mingled with the silver light of the moon above, they gathered in wide circles and drifted slowly through the water. Their tendrils glowed in unison, dimming and brightening in patterns that repeated like verses. The turtles watched patiently. The fish darted among the glowing shapes, and the crabs paused their endless work to listen. No one could say exactly what the jellyfish were telling, but all who saw it felt the same truth. The stories were about beginnings, about the pearl, and about the promise of life that was unfolding. The turtles, though they moved slowly, carried wisdom in their stillness. They often rested at the edges of the pearl's glow, eyes half closed, bodies heavy against the sand. And yet their presence was more than rest. To the smaller creatures, the turtles were like living anchors, a reminder that the ocean could be trusted, that time itself could be endured without fear. When storms above rattled the waters, when currents pressed too strongly, the creatures would gather near the turtles, and the turtles would simply remain unmoved, untroubled, until the sea calmed again. The crabs, restless by nature, were builders even then. Though they did not understand what they were shaping, their claws moved with tireless purpose. They dug hollows in neat rows, pushed shells into spirals, and carried stones to form small mounds. Sometimes they worked together, 2 or 3 at a time, passing a shell from claw to claw until it rested at the pearl's edge. Other times they worked alone, scuttling endlessly until the sand itself bore the marks of their quiet devotion. It is said that the earliest outlines of streets, plazas, and gathering spaces were first etched by crabs, marks the ocean itself later turned into permanent paths. The fish were the spark of movement, the restless tide that balanced the turtle's stillness. They swam in great schools, hundreds moving as one, weaving through the coral arches in intricate dances. At times they circled the pearl so quickly that their silver bodies became a ring of light around it, shimmering like a living crown. Other times they darted upward toward the surface, scattering bubbles like laughter before returning to the seabed. The fish gave energy to the gathering, a reminder that life was not only stillness, but also joy, play, and surprise. Together, these first citizens created a harmony unlike anything the ocean had seen before. They were not bound by language, nor by rules, nor by names. They were bound by presence. Each creature, in its own way, contributed to the unfolding dream. And yet, even in their harmony, there were mysteries. Sometimes shadows would move along the edge of the trenches, long, dark shapes gliding just beyond the pearl's glow, vanishing when watched too closely. Some believed these were guardians, keeping watch from the deep. Others thought they were reminders that the ocean, though generous, held secrets not meant to be touched. The first citizens never strayed into the trenches. They remained near the pearl, their sanctuary, their center. The seabed itself seemed to respond to their presence. Coral towers grew taller, forming what looked like meeting places. The sand smoothed itself into wide, flat spaces, perfect for gathering. Tiny blooms of glowing algae appeared on the rocks, shining like lanterns in the water. The ocean was shaping itself, not for one creature, but for all, a shared space, a place of belonging. It is said that one night, during the quietest hour, the jellyfish formed their widest circle yet. Dozens of them, glowing softly, drifted around the pearl in a great ring of light. The turtles settled within the circle, heavy and calm. The crabs scuttled into lines, forming patterns on the sand. The fish swam above in spirals, their silver bodies catching the pearl's glow. For the first time, the seabed became more than a place of silence. It became a gathering, a community. The pearl pulsed faintly, as though recognizing the moment, and the light spread farther than it ever had before, touching the outermost edges of the coral. Those who witnessed it remembered the feeling, though they had no words to describe it. It was the first moment the deep sea felt alive, not as scattered creatures, but as a people. The first citizens had not built homes, they had not spoken names, but they had created something greater, a shared heartbeat in the water. And though none of them knew it, the foundations of Bikini Bottom were being set, not in stone, not in walls, but in spirit. Time in the ocean was not measured by hours or days as we know them now. It was marked by tides, by the drifting of the moon across the surface, by the slow growth of coral and the rise of new life from the sand. And as these markers passed, the first citizens began to shape a rhythm together, a rhythm that would echo in one form or another through all the future years of Bikini Bottom. The jellyfish, pulsing with their quiet light, grew more intricate in their nightly gatherings. What once were simple rings of glowing movement became elaborate dances with patterns that wove inward and outward like living constellations. The other creatures came not only to watch, but to join. The fish learned to swim through the glowing shapes, scattering and returning at just the right moments. The crabs began to trace their shell spirals in response, etching designs that mirrored the jellyfish patterns onto the sand. Even the turtles, slow and steady, took part. By drifting into the circles, their massive shells casting shadows that shifted the light into new shapes. It was the first ritual born without plan, shared by instinct alone. The ocean, vast and eternal, had whispered, and its children had answered in movement and light. Soon this rhythm spilled into the days. The turtles became natural leaders, though they never commanded. They simply moved with purpose, and others followed. When a turtle glided to rest beneath a coral arch, fish swarmed there. Crabs carved markings. Jellyfish floated above. Wherever a turtle settled, life gathered. They were the unspoken centers, the slow heartbeats that drew the rest of the community together. The crabs, meanwhile, turned their building into something more deliberate. Instead of scattering shells in random spirals, they began arranging them into repeating patterns like lines or borders. They dug hollows in precise circles around the pearl's resting place, creating a basin that glowed like a natural amphitheater. Some believe this was the first true foundation of Bikini Bottom's central square, long before it had streets or buildings. The fish brought movement, always movement. They taught the others play, how to chase bubbles, how to weave in pairs, how to dart through narrow coral openings with sudden bursts of speed. Their endless energy spread to the crabs, who sometimes abandoned their building to chase a fish in a playful burst, or to the jellyfish, who added sudden flares of light to startle and delight the schools. Even the turtles, slow as they were, allowed themselves rare moments of play, flapping their broad fins to stir currents that carried the smaller creatures in swirling, delighted rushes. Thus, the seabed became more than silent survival. It became a place of joy. But joy alone did not define the first citizens. They also knew caution, for the ocean beyond the pearl's glow was vast and filled with shadows. There were nights when the fish refused to swim too far, when the jellyfish pulsed brighter as if warning, when the turtles held their ground near the coral arches with a firmness that spoke of danger. The crabs would scuttle close to the pearl during those nights, forming tight rings as though guarding the light itself. The shadows never came close enough to be seen clearly, but they were always there, drifting shapes, massive and slow, perhaps watching, perhaps simply passing. Some say they were ancient whales, guardians of the ocean's deepest songs, Others whisper they were older beings, spirits of the trenches, creatures too immense and timeless for even the pearl to summon. Whatever they were, their presence reminded the first citizens that though they had found community, they were still part of something far greater and more mysterious than themselves. And so balance defined their world, the joy of the fish, the patience of the turtles, the light of the jellyfish, the work of the crabs, all bound together by the mystery of the deep. As time passed, the seabed transformed. Coral arches grew more elaborate, curling into shapes that seemed almost sculpted by unseen hands. Algae blooms brightened the rocks, glowing like lamps along natural pathways. The pearl's glow deepened, spreading across the sand until even the farthest corners of the gathering place were bathed in its light. It is said that one day, the crabs carved a hollow so wide that it became a great basin, and the fish filled it with shells of every color they could find. The jellyfish floated above, their lights dancing across the shells while the turtles settled nearby, solemn and watchful. It was not planned, but it became the first true symbol of the first citizens' unity, a pool of color and light, a place where every creature had left its mark. Some legends say the pearl pulsed brighter than ever before that night, glowing with such warmth that even the shadows of the trenches withdrew for a time. And in that glow, the creatures felt not only the ocean's dream, but their own, a shared vision of a home, a place of belonging, a world yet to come. They could not name it, but it was the earliest heartbeat of Bikini Bottom. As seasons of the sea slipped quietly into one another, the community of the first citizens grew deeper in its bonds. Though they did not yet have walls or names or tools, they had something greater, a rhythm that turned their gathering place into more than a patch of seabed. It was becoming, without their knowing, the earliest version of a city. The jellyfish continued their nightly storytelling, drifting in rings of light. Their pulsing glow grew so well patterned that the other creatures could almost read them like a map. To the turtles, the jellyfish's slow fading and brightening meant patience and trust. To the fish, the sudden bursts of light were signals to dart and chase. To the crabs, the steady pulses were like instructions. Dig here, place there, shape this. In this way, the jellyfish became teachers without words, guiding the others in the building of a shared world. The turtles gave this world memory. They lived longer than most, and their slow minds seemed to hold on to details the others forgot. When the fish scattered, when storms shook the coral, when crabs lost their structures to waves, the turtles remembered. They carried the community back to the pearl, back to the basin of shells, back to the places where belonging was strongest. Their silence was not emptiness, but wisdom, as though they alone understood the ocean's true patience. The crabs, restless as ever, pushed beyond simple markings. They began to dig pathways, straight, purposeful trenches in the sand that guided movement from one place to another. Soon the seabed no longer felt like open wilderness. It felt shaped, designed, intentional. Some of these trenches curved into circles, forming gathering rings. Others stretched outward, connecting coral arches to the pearl's basin. A network was forming, one that, in ages to come, would echo in the streets of Bikini Bottom. The fish gave these spaces life. Without them, the seabed might have felt still, solemn, perhaps too heavy. But the schools filled every pathway with motion, weaving through coral, darting in playful spirals, scattering like silver confetti when startled. They were the laughter of the deep, the constant reminder that joy belonged just as much to a home as safety or structure. Their games became the music of the place, as vital as any shell, as meaningful as any pulse of the jellyfish. And so each citizen, gave something of themselves, and together they built what none could have made alone. But not all was gentle. There came nights when the currents turned harsh, when storms from the surface churned the seabed into chaos. Whole coral arches toppled, algae blooms were swept away, trenches filled with sand as though they had never been carved. In those nights, fear touched even the first citizens. The fish scattered far, sometimes not returning. The crabs clung desperately to rocks. The jellyfish dimmed their glow, and the turtles buried themselves deep beneath the sand. Yet each time, when the storm finally passed, they returned to the pearl. No matter how much was lost, no matter what the waters tore away, the pearl's glow remained steady. And so they rebuilt. The crabs carved new lines. The fish swam new dances. The jellyfish created new stories. The turtles endured, watching over all. Through these cycles of destruction and renewal, the seabed was forged stronger. What was rebuilt was never exactly the same as before. It was always slightly larger, more intricate, more intentional. The storms, harsh as they were, became the ocean's own hand, shaping and refining the dream of a community. Legends say that one night, after a particularly great storm, something new happened. The jellyfish gathered in their circle as they always did, but this time their glow did not form the usual rings. Instead, it wove upward, a spiraling column of light that stretched higher and higher into the water. The fish swirled around it. The crabs etched a wide circle in the sand, and the turtles rested at its base. For hours, the column pulsed, reaching toward the surface as if trying to touch the stars. When the light finally dimmed, the seabed was forever changed. The creatures looked around and felt it. Their gathering place was no longer just a safe spot in the ocean. It was a home. The pearl had given them light, but they had given it meaning. From that night on, the first citizens no longer lived only for themselves. The jellyfish glowed to guide the others, not just to express. The turtles positioned themselves where safety was needed, not just where comfort was found. The crabs carved lines to connect, not only to build. And the fish swam in patterns that seemed to celebrate the whole, not just their own joy. Together, they had become something larger than their separate lives, a family of the deep, a beginning of a world. And though centuries would pass before SpongeBob or Squidward or Sandy would ever walk these same sands, the essence of their community was already here. In the glow of jellyfish that became the lanterns of the night, in the patience of turtles that echoed in the calm voices of leaders, in the carvings of crabs that became the foundations of streets and homes, in the play of fish that even today fills Bikini Bottom with laughter. The first citizens of the deep did not know what they were building. They had no vision of pineapples turned into houses, or glass domes from the land above, or restaurants serving Krabby Patties. But they knew, in their simple, instinctive way, that they were part of something larger, a story unfolding, a dream being shaped, a home being born. And so the second chapter of Bikini Bottom's origins closed, not with words, not with walls, but with a shared silence, a shared light, and a shared promise that life, when gathered together, could become something beautiful. The first citizens had found unity in rhythm, light, and play. But unity, though strong, was not enough to withstand the demands of the ocean forever. The seas were restless. Storms from the surface grew harsher. The shadows from the trenches drifted closer. The seabed that had once seemed timeless was shifting, and so too did the creatures who called it home. Out of necessity, they began to change. What began as instinct slowly transformed into intention. The crabs, once content with carving patterns into the sand, started to think differently about their work. They no longer traced spirals just for beauty or dug trenches simply for direction. They began to carve walls, raised ridges of sand and stone to guard against currents. They stacked shells not only for decoration but to form barriers, small forts against the chaos of the water. At first, these creations were fragile, washed away after only a tide or two, but the crabs were persistent. They studied the way coral anchored itself to stone, the way algae clung to surfaces, the way turtles positioned their heavy shells to resist the push of waves. Slowly, their designs improved. Trenches deepened, walls thickened, arches were reinforced with coral and kelp. It was the birth of construction. Not just markings, not just ritual, but true building. The fish, restless and quick-minded, adapted alongside them. Where the crabs were patient diggers, the fish were gatherers. They darted through reefs and wrecks, bringing back small treasures from the sea. Hollow shells, smooth pebbles, driftwood that had sunk from the world above. Some brought shards of broken pottery, clay jars, and even pieces of glass, remnants of human life that had slipped into the ocean long before Bikini Bottom existed. These strange artifacts glimmered with new possibilities, and the fish delighted in delivering them to the crab, who puzzled over how they might be used. The jellyfish, though builders in a different way, contributed as well. Their light became the first lanterns of the sea. By hovering above a structure, their soft glow turned ordinary stone circles into gathering halls, trenches into glowing paths, and hollowed-out coral into sanctuaries. They transformed crude structures into spaces that felt alive, radiant, and safe. In many ways, their role was spiritual, turning shelters into homes and fortresses into symbols of hope. The turtles, ever slow but ever steady, gave direction to this rise of building. They did not shape stone or carry shells, but they chose where things should stand. With their long lifespans and unshakable patience, the turtles had learned the language of the currents and the moods of the seabed. They guided the crabs to carve their walls where the sand was firmest, told the fish where treasures would endure, and placed themselves as living anchors at the heart of the new structures. If the crabs were the hands of the builders and the fish were the gatherers, then the turtles were the architects, the visionaries who gave shape to the city before it was a city. What grew from their combined efforts was unlike anything the ocean had yet seen. Coral arches were reinforced into gateways. Pathways of shells lined the seabed, winding like streets between open plazas. Hollowed-out stone served as shelters against storms. Some creatures even learned to weave seaweed into nets and curtains, draped across entrances to keep predators at bay. The pearl, glowing ever at the heart of it all, became enshrined within the greatest of these creations. The crabs built a circle of stone around it, fortified with coral pillars, while the jellyfish lit it from above in soft hues. The fish brought treasures from afar, brightly colored shells, shards of reflective glass, even bits of gold and silver that had sunk from ships above, and laid them at its base. It was no longer just a glowing pearl. It was a beacon, a sacred heart, a symbol of everything they had built together. Legends call this period the Age of Builders. It was the first time the sea's citizens had shaped their world with purpose rather than simply drifting within it. And though their structures were humble compared to the towering buildings of Bikini Bottom today, they marked a turning point. The seabed was no longer just a place of gathering. It was becoming a city alive with the marks of those who lived there. Still, this new era was not without challenge. Structures required care, and storms did not relent simply because walls were raised. Many nights were filled with rebuilding what had been lost, of learning again and again how to anchor stronger, how to build higher, how to resist the endless push of the ocean. But each failure led to new wisdom, each collapse to new resilience. The ocean, it seemed, was testing its children, not to break them, but to shape them. And the builders, patient and persistent, answered the challenge. As the builders' creations began to rise across the seabed, something subtle but profound started to change among the citizens themselves. Structures shaped behavior. Where once the community had gathered loosely around the pearl or drifted freely through the waters, now they had pathways to follow, plazas to return to, and boundaries that defined inside from outside. The seabed was becoming organized, and with organization came a new sense of belonging. The fish, who had always been playful wanderers, now darted along the carved pathways as though they were streets, racing in circles around coral towers and weaving through shell-arched doorways. Their games took on new dimensions, no longer boundless, but tied to the patterns of the city. What had once been a simple chase through open waters now resembled parades, dances, and celebrations. The fish gave life to the stone and coral, proving that walls did not cage them, but gave their joy a stage. The crabs, meanwhile, grew increasingly ambitious. Small trenches and ridges were no longer enough. They began experimenting with height. Piling stone upon stone, they created the first rudimentary towers, low, blocky structures that rose above the seabed like watchposts. They learned that by placing heavier shells and rocks at the base and lighter materials at the top, their towers could endure the pressure of waves. Some even adorned the tops of these towers with glowing jellyfish, turning them into lighthouses of the deep. For the first time, the ocean floor had landmarks, shapes that could be seen from afar, guiding the citizens back to their home. To a wandering fish lost in the current, the glow of a tower was as comforting as the pearl itself. The turtles, though slow in their movements, brought foresight to these new creations. They would pause for long stretches, watching the way currents bent around a tower, or how sand drifted into a trench. With a single gesture of their flippers, they could instruct the crabs to shift a wall, or the fish to place a shell in a certain way. Their adjustments were always quiet, almost imperceptible, yet they ensured the structures endured where they otherwise would have failed. And then there were the jellyfish. Though they did not shape stone, their role was no less vital. They turned buildings into symbols. A circle of pillars around the pearl became, under their glow, a temple. A hollowed coral cavern became, beneath their hovering lights, a hall for gathering. Their bioluminescence gave meaning to architecture, making the seabed feel not just safe, but sacred. Over time, rituals formed around these spaces. At dawn, when light from the surface filtered dimly through the waves, the fish gathered in the plazas, spiraling in patterns that mirrored the rising sun. At night, the jellyfish pulsed in steady rhythms, guiding the community into rest. The crabs lined the pathways with new shells, their claws clacking like bells to mark the passing of days. Even the turtles, ancient and deliberate, began to position themselves in the plazas at certain hours, their presence itself becoming a ritual, a silent sign of stability. It was in this age that myths began to grow around the builders. Some said the crabs were descendants of spirits who once lived in stone, now shaping their ancient homes anew. Others whispered that the jellyfish were not simply creatures, but fragments of starlight that had fallen to the sea. The fish, with their endless motion, were thought to embody the breath of the ocean itself, while the turtles were seen as guardians chosen by time to remember what others would forget. Whether these tales were truth or invention mattered little. What mattered was that the community believed in them, and belief gave their city depth beyond stone and shell. It was no longer only a place of survival, it was a place of meaning. But with meaning came conflict. Not every creature agreed on how the city should grow. Some crabs argued for stronger walls, fearing predators that prowled the edges of the deep. The fish, however, resisted too much enclosure, preferring open plazas where they could dart and play. The jellyfish glowed in favor of harmony, while the turtles mediated slowly, urging patience. These disagreements were small at first, but they revealed something new. The builders had created not only a home, but a society. And societies, even in their earliest forms, carried the seeds of difference. Still, despite these tensions, the work continued. New towers rose, trenches deepened. Coral gardens were planted and carefully tended, providing food and color alike. Driftwood and stone were arranged into what might be called the first furniture. Resting spots where turtles settled, or alcoves where fish gathered in groups. Life was no longer a drifting current. It had form, rhythm, and permanence. From above, had any wandering human looked down into the sea, they might have mistaken the seabed for a settlement not unlike their own villages. Circles of light glowing like lanterns, winding paths crossing between structures, creatures moving purposefully between spaces. It was civilization in its earliest breath. The pearl, of course, remained the center. Guarded by stone, lit by jellyfish, honored by fish and crabs alike. It was more than a relic. It was a promise, a reminder that their efforts were not in vain. No matter how far they built outward, they always returned to its glow. And perhaps it was this devotion to a shared heart that kept them from fracturing entirely, even as their disagreements grew sharper. For the builders were still learning not only how to shape stone, but how to live within what they had shaped. The more the builders raised their creations, the more the sea itself seemed to challenge them. Each wall, each tower, each plaza was not just a victory over the wildness of the ocean, but an invitation for the ocean to respond, and respond it did, with storms fiercer than any they had known before. The first great storm struck when the city was still young. A whirl of currents twisted across the seabed, snapping coral, toppling towers and scattering shells like grains of sand. The fish fled into cracks and caverns, and the crabs clung desperately to their walls, and the jellyfish dimmed their glow in fear. When the storm at last receded, much of what they had built lay in ruin. Towers were broken, trenches filled with sand, and the once proud plaza around the pearl was half buried in debris. For many, despair hung heavy in the waters. Some fish questioned whether the work was worth it. Why build, they argued, if the ocean itself would always undo their efforts? The crabs, weary from rebuilding, considered abandoning height altogether, retreating once more to shallow grooves in the sand. Even the jellyfish hovered uncertainly, their glow flickering faintly in the dark. It was then that the turtles reminded them of something essential. The sea would always test them, but testing was not destruction. It was a lesson. They urged patience, showing the builders how certain parts of the seabed held firm even through the storm, how certain arches bent with the current instead of breaking. They taught the crabs to carve deeper foundations, to bury stones beneath the sand before stacking others on top. They showed the fish how driftwood woven with kelp could reinforce walls and prevent them from toppling. And so, from the ruins of the storm, knowledge emerged. The next towers were stronger, their bases broader, their peaks flexible enough to sway rather than snap. Trenches were no longer shallow lines, but deep channels designed to guide currents away from plazas. Entire structures were rebuilt, not as fragile barriers against the ocean, but as companions to its movements, shaping the flow rather than fighting it. With each new trial, the builders grew wiser. Predators tested their walls too, lurking eels, prowling sharks, and even enormous squids from the darker trenches. But the city's defenses adapted. Fish scouts swam the outer edges, darting back with warnings at the first sign of danger. Crabs strengthened gates of stone and shells, placing them at key passages. Jellyfish formed glowing rings around the heart of the city, their light warding off creatures unused to such brilliance. And the turtles, silent, patient, immovable, placed themselves at the entrances, a living shield that few predators dared to challenge. In time, the predators withdrew, seeking easier prey elsewhere. The city endured, and with each victory came pride. Yet survival was only part of the builders' story. As their creations grew, so too did their imagination. What began as walls and towers soon blossomed into artistry. The fish arranged shells into mosaics across the seabed, patterns of spirals and waves that shimmered under the glow of the jellyfish. Crabs carved shapes into stone, depicting creatures, currents, and even the pearl itself in crude but recognizable designs. Some fish began to gather bright shards of glass, embedding them into walls so that they glittered like stars. The city was no longer merely functional. It was beautiful. And beauty, like the pearl, gave the citizens something to believe in. It reminded them that their labor was not only for safety, but for joy. That even in the depths of the sea, where darkness pressed endlessly from all sides, light and art could thrive. But as their city grew more radiant, so too did whispers of division. Among the fish, some believed the pearl's light should be spread across the seabed, shared more freely instead of being kept within its shrine. The crabs, protective and disciplined, resisted, arguing that the pearl must remain at the center, guarded above all else. The jellyfish glowed with uncertainty, torn between the two visions, while the turtles urged calm, insisting that balance must be preserved. These disagreements never erupted into full conflict, but they seeded doubt. The builders had achieved so much together, but the very structures they had raised made them different from one another. Some wanted expansion, some wanted preservation, and some longed for freedom beyond walls. Still, even amid debate, the work continued. And perhaps it was the debates themselves that spurred greater creativity. For when one group resisted a wall, another argued for an open plaza. When some wanted towers, others preferred gardens. Each vision shaped the city differently, layering complexity upon complexity until the seabed resembled not just one design, but many interwoven ideas. This tension, between unity and difference, between survival and beauty, was what truly defined the age of builders. It was not a perfect harmony, but it was alive, vibrant, and constantly shifting. And though none of them could have known it, these earliest struggles mirrored the ones that would echo through Bikini Bottom for all time. The tension between tradition and change, between community and individuality, between safety and freedom. The seeds of Bikini Bottom's soul were being planted here, stone by stone, argument by argument, dream by dream. As the years flowed onward, the builder's city became not only a place of shelter, but a world of its own. It stretched outward from the pearl like a living reef, each new generation of fish, crabs, turtles, and jellyfish adding their own marks. Pathways became streets, plazas turned into districts, and towers rose so high they seemed to brush against the undercurrents above. The seabed no longer looked wild and scattered. It pulsed with intention, with order, with life. But no age lasts forever. The builder's era, bright as it was, began to wane under the weight of its own success. The city was no longer a fragile village clinging to survival. It was strong, enduring, proud. And with strength came ambition. Some citizens began to look beyond the boundaries of their settlement, wondering what lay in the further reaches of the sea. Others argued that they should fortify what they already had, build their walls taller, carve their shrines deeper, and ensure that nothing could ever threaten them again. This divide widened slowly like a crack in stone that deepens with every tide. The fish, ever restless, were the first to wander outward. They swam beyond the glow of the jellyfish and found caverns glittering with new minerals, fields of kelp untouched by builders' hands, and open stretches of seabed where currents danced freely. They returned with stories of freedom, color, and untapped wonder. Some wanted to move outward and start new settlements, to see whether the pearl's light could guide them even from afar. The crabs, in contrast, remained staunch defenders of the center. To them, the pearl was not just a relic, but the heartbeat of their civilization. To scatter was to weaken. They doubled their efforts on the city's walls, sharpening edges, reinforcing towers, and carving warnings into stone. The pearl, they declared, must always be protected above all else. The jellyfish flickered with indecision. They drifted between the explorers and the guardians, their glow dim when faced with conflict. They longed for harmony, for a unity that could bridge the two visions, but the currents of disagreement were too strong, and the turtles, wise but weary, could only watch. They reminded both sides that the sea had always been larger than their city, and that balance between outward growth and inward strength was the only way forward. Yet even their voices, heavy with the weight of ages, could not mend every rift. Despite these differences, the builders continued to shape. Outward, new outposts began to appear, small clusters of coral walls, stone markers, and glowing jellyfish lanterns scattered across the seabed. Inward, the central city grew ever denser, its towers stretching higher and its shrines more elaborate. What had once been a single unified project was now two visions growing side by side. It was during this time that the pearl itself began to change. No longer was its glow steady and constant. Some nights its light shimmered brighter, filling the city with radiance. Other nights it dimmed, as though testing the faith of those who followed it. The builders interpreted this in different ways. To the crabs, the dimming meant the pearl was displeased with those who strayed too far. To the fish, its flickering meant it longed to spread its light further, to shine across new lands. These conflicting interpretations only deepened the divide, but they also gave rise to something new, the first legends of prophecy. The citizens began to tell stories of what the pearl wanted, what it signified, and what destiny awaited them. In their debates, they were no longer just building a city, they were building the very myths that would guide future generations. And so the Builder's Age, though marked by conflict, left behind more than structures. It left behind ideas. It left behind a sense that Bikini Bottom, though it did not yet bear that name, was more than a patch of seabed. It was a place where meaning itself was shaped, where belief and stone intertwined. The final years of this era saw the city reach its height. Towers gleamed with shells and glass, plazas shimmered with mosaics, and the glow of jellyfish stretched farther than ever before. The fish darted joyfully between districts. The crabs marched proudly along their walls. The jellyfish pulsed in calm rhythms, and the turtles rested silently at the heart of it all. For a time, despite their disagreements, there was balance. But history is never still. The builders could not have known that their divisions would echo into the ages. They could not have foreseen that their city, for all its strength, would one day crumble, reshaped by tides, storms, and the choices of those who came after. What they did know, however, was this. They had transformed the seabed. They had taken silence and emptiness and filled it with form, purpose, and life. They had proven that even in the deepest waters, creation was possible. And in doing so, they had laid the foundations, not only of a city, but of a destiny. For long after the towers crumbled and the plazas were buried in sand, the memory of the builders remained. Their stones, their stories, their shimmering pearl would inspire generations yet to come. They had risen from the silence of the ocean, and in their rise, they had given the deep a voice. And that voice would echo through time, becoming the whispers that future citizens of Bikini Bottom would hear in their dreams. The builders were gone, but their spirit endured. Time in the ocean does not move like it does on the surface. Waves crash, storms pass, and ships rise and fall. But the deep remembers differently. Structures crumble into coral gardens, stories blur into songs, and what was once history becomes myth. So it was with the builders. Generations after the last crab carved stone into walls and the last turtle guided the placement of a tower, their city began to fade. Towers toppled, plazas filled with sand, and the glow of the pearl became veiled by drifting currents. The citizens who followed were left with fragments, arches half buried in silt, mosaics that no longer told their full story, and stones whose patterns looked more like riddles than instructions. Yet while the physical city eroded, its memory grew. What the ocean took away in stone, it returned in imagination. The sea's citizens, no longer living in the builder's age, began to tell stories about it instead, and these stories became their inheritance. The jellyfish were the first keepers of legend. Their drifting glow was perfect for storytelling, for when they pulsed together in rhythm, their light became a canvas against the dark. Schools of fish would gather around them, watching patterns of light, while listening to soft voices recounting the days of the builders. In their telling, the crabs were not just builders, they were warriors of stone, guardians of the sacred pearl. The fish were not mere gatherers, they were seekers of treasure whose speed carried wisdom from the edges of the sea. And the turtles, ancient and slow, became prophets who could hear the whispers of the deep itself. The crabs, naturally, shaped the legends differently. To them, the builders were remembered as defenders above all. The walls became symbols of loyalty, the towers monuments of vigilance. They told their young that the pearl's dimming was a warning from the ocean, a reminder that unity must never be abandoned. Every crab that carved into the sand believed they were echoing their ancestors, carrying on a duty that stretched across ages. The fish, however, told brighter stories. They sang of journeys beyond the city, of glowing pearls scattered like stars across the seabed, each one a gift waiting to be found. To them, the builders were explorers who refused to be caged by walls. Their legends told of distant reefs, hidden caverns, and treasures so bright they could rival the pearl itself. These tales fueled their own restless currents, driving them outward into adventure. And then there were the turtles. Slow, solemn, patient. They carried the legends with a weight unlike any other. To them, the builders were neither warriors nor explorers, but dreamers. The turtles told their hatchlings that the city had not been built of stone alone, but of faith. They spoke of how the builders had heard the ocean's silence and answered it with creation. In their stories, the pearl was not just a relic, but a living memory of the sea itself entrusted to those who would listen. Thus, the builders became more than history. They became legend, and with the legend came imagination. Soon the stories grew taller than the towers that once stood. The crabs claimed that the walls had reached so high they touched the surface, shielding the sea from storms above. The fish whispered of tunnels carved so deep they connected to every reef in the ocean. The jellyfish spoke of glowing bridges of light that could lead travelers safely through even the darkest trenches. And the turtles told of a pearl so vast that it shone like a second sun beneath the waves. None of it was true, at least not in the way it was told. But that did not matter. Truth was less important than meaning. The legends gave the sea's citizens identity, purpose, and belonging. They were no longer just creatures drifting in currents. They were heirs of a legacy, children of the builders, protectors of a story larger than themselves. The age of legends, as it came to be known, was an era of storytelling. Every reef became a stage, every cavern a chamber of echoing myths. Songs drifted like currents from community to community, shaping each generation's sense of who they were and what their place was in the ocean. But this age was not only about preserving the past. Legends, by their very nature, are alive. They grow, they shift, they take on new meanings. And so the citizens of the sea began not only to tell the stories of the builders, but to weave themselves into them. Each generation added its own colors, its own heroes, its own prophecies. One legend told of a crab who built a wall so strong it could hold back the fiercest storm. But in truth, the storm was a metaphor for fear, and the wall was courage itself. Another legend spoke of a fish who swam beyond the edges of the known sea, finding not just treasures, but wisdom hidden in the silence of distant waters. Jellyfish told of ancestors whose glow could guide the lost back to safety, and turtles whispered of dreams where the ocean itself spoke to them in voices older than time. The sea was alive with myth, and in those myths, the builders lived on. As the legends spread, they did more than entertain. They began to shape the very fabric of undersea life. Stories were not just told for amusement. They became lessons, codes of conduct, and even the foundation of rituals. Among the crabs, for example, children were taught to carve small stones with their claws as part of a coming-of-age tradition. These carvings rarely survived the tides for long, but that was not the point. The ritual was a memory in action, a way of reminding each new generation that they were the descendants of builders, that their claws were not only for defense but for creation. Even the smallest crab learned to chip their mark into stone, no matter how crude. The fish developed their own practices. Inspired by the tales of explorers, young fish would swim in groups toward the edges of their territory, venturing farther than they had ever dared before. They would return with whatever they could find, shiny shells, drifting wood, strange debris from the surface, and present it as proof of their courage. In this way, the fish tied their identity not to walls or shrines, but to the thrill of discovery and the promise of treasures yet unseen. The jellyfish, ever luminous, shaped their legends into ceremonies of light. At certain times of the year, when the currents slowed and the sea grew calm, entire colonies would drift together and pulse in perfect harmony. Waves of glow rolled across the water, creating living constellations beneath the waves. These gatherings were said to honor the builders, to mimic the way they had once lit their city with the sacred pearl. But for the young jellyfish who participated, it was also a moment of unity, a reminder that even in drifting they belonged to something greater. And the turtles, slow and solemn, created rituals of remembrance. Once each cycle, they would gather in silence around the oldest ruins, resting their shells against fallen stones. They would remain there for hours, unmoving, as though listening to the whispers of the sea. The younger creatures mocked them sometimes, calling their stillness boring. Yet the turtles endured, teaching that patience itself was a form of wisdom, and that to listen without speaking was a sacred act. Thus, the legends of the builders were not confined to words. They lived in practice, in movement, in the rhythms of daily life. The sea itself became a tapestry of myth, woven not only in memory but in behavior. But legends, powerful as they are, rarely remain uniform. Over time, each group shaped the stories to serve its own needs. Among the crabs, the builders were remembered almost as kings, strong and unyielding. Among the fish, they were wanderers, seeking freedom. The jellyfish made them artists of light, while the turtles made them prophets of silence. These differences, subtle at first, began to grow sharper as generations passed. Communities began to disagree not only about what the builders had done, but about what their legacy demanded. In one reef, a group of crabs built a wall around their home, insisting it was the will of their ancestors to protect what was theirs. In another, schools of fish swam farther and farther from the ruins, believing their ancestors' true calling was to seek new horizons. The jellyfish glowed in protest, claiming that both sides had misunderstood, that the builders were neither conquerors nor wanderers, but dreamers who sought beauty. And the turtles, always deliberate, warned that fighting over legends would only darken the sea. Still, disagreements simmered. They rarely flared into true conflict, but the seeds of division were there. The same stories that once united now pulled apart, stretched thin by interpretation. The ocean is vast, and its creatures are many, and no single vision of the builders could satisfy them all. And yet, for all the disagreements, the legends continued to bind them in subtle ways. Even when two groups argued fiercely, they still spoke of the builders. They still acknowledged the pearl, the walls, the towers, the plazas. Their visions differed, but their foundation was shared. It was as though the builders had become a common language, one that each community could translate differently, but never abandon entirely. Over time, new myths began to grow from this foundation. Heroes emerged in stories, creatures who, though not part of the original builders, carried echoes of their spirit. A brave crab who sacrificed his claw to save a neighbor from a shark became immortalized as a descendant of the stone carvers. A curious fish who discovered a hidden cave filled with glowing algae was celebrated as kin to the pearl seekers. A jellyfish who pulsed alone through a storm, guiding a lost school of fish to safety, was remembered as one of the lightkeepers. And a turtle who carried 3 hatchlings across miles of current without rest was praised as a prophet of endurance. These new legends blended seamlessly with the old, expanding the mythos of the sea. It was no longer just about the builders themselves, but about all who carried their spirit. In this way, the age of legends grew richer with every passing generation, each story building upon the last, like coral stacking upon coral. The ocean, once silent, now roared with tales. As the legends deepened, they did more than inspire rituals and ceremonies. They began to influence how communities were governed. In a world where written laws did not exist, myths became the foundation of justice, authority, and order. Among the crabs, councils of elders rose to prominence. Each elder was believed to represent a line of ancestry that stretched back to the first stone carvers. Decisions about disputes or defenses were settled not by personal opinion, but by recalling stories of the builders. If a young crab quarreled with a neighbor over territory, the elders would invoke the tale of the wall, reminding them that unity was more important than pride. If one was accused of cowardice during a hunt, the elders retold the legend of the crab who faced storms without retreat. In this way, myth became law, and elders became interpreters of ancient truth. The fish, more restless and adventurous, organized themselves differently. Leadership often belonged to those who could tell the best stories. A fish who returned from a daring journey with a vivid tale, whether entirely true or not, was celebrated, admired, and often obeyed. For them, authority was tied to imagination and vision. A leader was not the one who held power, but the one who could inspire others to swim further, to see beyond the horizon. Myths of the builders as explorers became the foundation of the system, a justification. The discovery itself was a kind of sacred duty. The jellyfish, drifting and luminous, required no central leader at all. Their colonies pulsed with collective rhythm, and decisions were made almost unconsciously, as though guided by shared instinct. Still, legends played their part. Those jellyfish who could weave glowing displays most beautifully, who could recreate scenes from the builders' stories in radiant patterns, were given honor and reverence. Though they had no thrones, these storytellers became symbolic leaders, guardians of memory through light. And then there were the turtles. Patient, solemn, deliberate, their communities turned to the oldest among them, not because of strength or daring, but because of time. To be old was to be closer to the builders, to carry more of their silence in one's shell. The elders did not speak often, but when they did, their words carried weight. Their laws were not rules, but teachings woven from myth. If the builders were remembered as prophets of creation, then the turtles saw themselves as prophets of endurance. Their governance was less about control and more about guidance, allowing life to flow with the currents rather than against them. Thus, the legends became more than stories. They became constitutions, invisible but binding. But with power comes conflict. As each group shaped the legends to their own identity, tensions arose. Some crabs accused the fish of disrespecting the builders by wandering so far from the ruins. The fish countered, saying that true loyalty to the builders meant seeking new treasures, not clinging to crumbling walls. The jellyfish drifted between, urging both sides to remember that the builders were creators of beauty, not rivals. The turtles warned that if the stories were twisted for power, they would lose their meaning altogether. Still, divisions deepened. And there are whispers of a time when these disagreements nearly tore the sea apart. One legend speaks of the Great Rift, not of stone or water, but of hearts. The crabs, it is said, built a massive barrier of coral, claiming to protect their territory from wandering schools of fish. The fish, angered, responded by swimming in endless spirals around the reef, disrupting the crabs' hunts and mocking their rigid walls. The jellyfish, caught between the two, glowed so brightly that the water shimmered like fire. The turtles, as ever, moved slowly through the chaos, warning both sides that anger was a shadow that could devour even the pearl's memory. Whether this great rift truly happened, or whether it was only a tale, is uncertain. Perhaps it was a parable, a warning told by elders to keep pride from boiling into conflict. But real or not, the story carried weight. It reminded all who heard it that legends, if misused, could divide as easily as they could unite. Ironically, it was the very stories that caused strife which also prevented total collapse. Even as groups quarreled, they still drew upon the same mythic source. The builders were still the common root, the pearl still the symbol they all revered. Arguments were fierce, but beneath them was a shared reverence that bound the sea together more tightly than any wall. As generations passed, the disagreements softened. Communities grew more accustomed to their differences, and the diversity of interpretation came to be seen as strength rather than threat. Crabs, fish, jellyfish, and turtles might argue endlessly about the builders' true legacy, but in their arguments the memory of the builders was kept alive. And so the age of legends flourished not in silence, but in chorus. 1,000 voices, each telling the story differently, yet all harmonizing in reverence for the same mysterious past. What made this age remarkable was not simply the stories themselves, but the way those stories became living forces. They guided claws, fins, pulses, and shells. They shaped homes, journeys, ceremonies, and councils. They determined who led, who followed, who belonged, and who strayed. It was an age not of facts, but of meaning. An age where the ocean itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with myth. As the age of legends ripened, the stories grew grander, stretching from simple recollections of the builders to prophecies that reached into futures no creature had yet seen. It was during this time that whispers began of a return, not of the builders themselves, but of their spirit, their light, and their pearl. Some claim that the pearl, though long hidden within the fortified heart of the seabed, was not meant to remain still forever. Its glow, they said, was only sleeping, waiting for the right time to awaken once more. One prophecy told by the crab spoke of the day of stone fire, when the seabed would tremble, and coral structures would blaze as though lit from within. On that day, the walls would break, but from their ruins, stronger foundations would rise, carrying forward the builder's gift of endurance. For the crabs, this prophecy was both a warning and a comfort. Even collapse could be sacred, so long as rebuilding followed. Among the fish, the prophecies took a more adventurous tone. Their storytellers whispered of the tide beyond tides, when a current unlike any other would sweep through the sea, carrying the bravest souls into unknown realms. In these myths, the pearl was a compass, its glow pointing not downward into the sand, but outward toward hidden oceans. For the fish, the prophecy was a call to seek, to push boundaries, and to trust that discovery itself was divine. The jellyfish, with their pulsing light, spoke of a more ethereal vision, the great illumination. They believed that one day, the pearl's radiance would ignite the whole sea, dissolving all shadows and revealing truths hidden since the beginning of time. On that day, they said, the builder's silence would finally be broken, replaced by a music so vast that every creature, from the smallest shrimp to the oldest whale, would join the same rhythm. The turtles, however, offered a slower, quieter prophecy. Their elders spoke of the long shelling, when the ocean would grow weary and civilizations would rise and fall like waves. But through it all, the pearl would remain, carried not by force but by patience. They believed that true inheritance was not found in sudden revelations or dramatic awakenings, but in endurance, century after century, until at last, the ocean's children were ready to carry the builder's work forward in wisdom. Thus, even prophecy divided and unified at once. Each community held its own vision of destiny, yet all agreed on the central truth. The builder's legacy was not over. Their silence was not the end of the story. Something more awaited. The effect of these prophecies was profound. They gave meaning to hardship, purpose to patience, and direction to wandering. When storms struck, the crabs reminded themselves of the day of stonefire. When explorers swam far, the fish spoke of the tide beyond tides. When nights felt especially dark, the jellyfish pulsed in memory of the great illumination. And when time itself weighed heavy, the turtles whispered of the long shelling. It was not that these prophecies were expected to be fulfilled in a single lifetime. Few creatures believed they would live to see such wonders. Instead, the prophecies acted as stars in the deep, a distant glow, unreachable, yet always guiding. Over generations, the age of legends became less about what had happened and more about what could happen. Myths were no longer simply retellings of the builders' past, but maps toward a hoped-for future. And in this transformation, the ocean found resilience. For so long as there was a promise ahead, no hardship could truly extinguish hope. But legends, as they grew, also wove mystery. Some began to wonder if the builders themselves had left the pearl as a message. Was it truly a remnant of their presence, or a seed of something yet to come? Did the builders vanish, or had they simply stepped aside, waiting for their children to discover the courage to follow in their path? No one knew. The silence of the builders was both haunting and inspiring. It was a silence that contained infinite possibility. And so the age of legends drew to a close, not with finality, but with anticipation. It was an age of stories that bound together every current, every reef, every creature. It was an age that taught them to endure storms, to seek the unknown, to pulse with light, and to carry patience across centuries. Most importantly, it was an age that prepared the sea for what was to come. For beyond the age of legends lay another transformation, one that would turn myths into monuments, prophecies into ambitions, and stories into structures of power and glory. The ocean was readying itself for something new. The silent builders had left a legacy greater than walls or treasures. They had left behind imagination, and imagination, once awakened, could never again be silenced. Thus ended the Age of Legends, an age that began with whispers in the dark and ended with voices echoing toward futures unseen. And from those echoes, the next chapter of Bikini Bottom's story would rise. The ocean had carried its people through the silence of beginnings, through the dawn of first citizens, and into the age of builders and legends. But now something new began to stir in the waters, something quieter than myths, yet just as powerful. It was not a single story or a hero or a glowing pearl. It was the slow and steady weaving of lives together, the binding of families, rituals, and trades into something greater than themselves. Where once there had been drifting groups of fish, solitary turtles, wandering crabs, and glowing jellyfish colonies, there now emerged the first hints of permanence. They no longer came together only for rituals at the Pearl or for rare celebrations of legend. Instead, they began to linger. They stayed. And in staying, they planted the first invisible seeds of what would one day be known as a town. The change began in the most practical of ways, with shelter. For generations, the sea creatures had hidden in reefs, caves, and kelp forests, using what nature provided. But now, inspired by the builder's age, they began to experiment. Crabs stacked shells and coral to form low walls around their dens. Fish wove seaweed strands into nests within rocky alcoves. Jellyfish, who had once been nomadic, tethered themselves to soft groves of anemones, creating places where their pulsing lights could gather night after night. Turtles carved wide, gentle hollows into sandy seabeds, smoothing them into resting grounds for their kin. Each of these shelters alone might have seemed small, but together they marked something profound, the shift from wandering to dwelling. The sea was no longer only a vast expanse to survive in. It was slowly becoming a home. And where creatures made homes, trade followed. At first it was nothing more than the casual exchange of necessity. A crab might offer a shard of coral, smooth sharp enough to cut through kelp, in exchange for fish scales that glimmered brightly enough to lure prey. A jellyfish might gift glowing stingers to light a darkened trench, receiving in return a turtle's so sturdy shell fragments that could be shaped into protective charms. These exchanges, though small, carried great weight. They wove invisible threads between families and groups, threads that made isolation less desirable and cooperation more rewarding. A fish who once darted alone through empty waters now had reason to return to a particular coral alcove, not because of myth, but because there were neighbors there who shared food, tools, and companionship. In time, these exchanges became gathering. The first markets of the sea were not planned places, but drifting spaces where creatures naturally convened. Picture it. A clearing in a kelp forest where fish hung shimmering objects like ornaments. A hollow near the reef where crabs piled coral tools. A sandy basin where turtles brought smooth stones from distant shores. A glowing field of jellyfish where their lights illuminated the wares. There was no coin, no fixed trade, but there was trust, and that trust was worth more than treasure. And with markets came the rhythm of community life. It was no longer only festivals of legend that drew creatures together. Now, every current, every tide carried the potential for meeting, for sharing, for building bonds that extended beyond one's own kind. Yet something else, more subtle, grew alongside these gatherings, the beginnings of rules. In the early days, there had been no need for them. The sea was wide and survival was simple. But as groups clustered closer, as dwellings gathered near markets, and as markets became more frequent, disputes inevitably arose. Whose coral wall belonged where? Who had the right to use the glowing lights of jellyfish? Who decided which family could dwell in which hollow of the reef? The legends of the Age of Heroes still lingered in their minds, and so rather than settle disputes through endless conflict, they looked to the wisdom of their stories. From Clomar's tale, they learned humility. From Nerissa's, fairness. From Lamara's, selflessness. From Oren's, patience. And with these lessons, they shaped the earliest forms of shared agreement. There were no written laws, no tablets or scrolls, but there were spoken pacts. If a crab built a wall, it was his family's dwelling unless abandoned. If jellyfish shared their glow, it was to be respected, not stolen. If a turtle smoothed a resting ground, it was to be left in peace. And if disputes grew too great, they would return to the circle of storytellers, letting the community itself decide through tale and wisdom. Over time, this web of dwellings, markets, and agreements began to take on a shape. A reef that had once been nothing more than stone and coral became a cluster of homes. The kelp forest clearing, once empty, became a place of meeting. The sandy hollows became sacred resting grounds for turtles, protected by respect. And above it all, the jellyfish lights glowed softly each night, like lanterns hanging in a town square. It was not yet Bikini Bottom, not yet a true town. But it was something new, something precious. A community bound not just by survival, but by choice. And as these creatures began to gather not only for need, but for belonging, the sea itself seemed to shift. The waters around the reef grew quieter, more still, as though the ocean itself recognized the transformation taking place. For the first time in history, the endless drift of the sea gave way to something steady, the first heartbeat of a town. The growing heart of this early community beat strongest at the meeting grounds, the places where creatures crossed paths not by chance, but with intention. Though no one had yet spoken the word town, the feeling was unmistakable. There was safety in numbers, comfort in routine, and joy in belonging. It began with rituals that shifted away from purely mythic storytelling and into something more practical, the rhythms of daily life. Where once the storytellers had gathered only on sacred nights to honor legends, now stories were told at markets, in homes, even while constructing walls or weaving seaweed nets. Myths became everyday guidance, and advice passed from elder to child, as naturally as tides rising and falling. And slowly, what had been scattered families became neighborhoods. A family of crabs might cluster near a rocky ridge, their coral walls rising side by side. Jellyfish, though naturally nomadic, began to group their glowing forms into soft colonies, providing nightly light for nearby fish dwellings. Fish schools found hollows within the reef, and turtles rested in wide sandy spaces at the town's edge. Each creature, each group, found its place in the growing mosaic. With neighborhoods came the need for shared paths. At first, the sea creatures simply swam wherever currents carried them, but as more permanent dwellings emerged, certain routes became favored. A trail through the kelp forest where fish brushed aside weeds became smoother with time, like a well-worn road. Crabs carved grooves along sandy floors, guiding travelers between markets. Turtles, with their slow and steady pace, pressed wide lanes through silt, and these paths naturally became the arteries of the new community. And as creatures followed these paths, they began to meet more often, exchange more frequently, and depend more deeply on one another. The reef was no longer a scattered cluster of homes. It was a woven net of connection, where each thread strengthened the others. Yet the sea, ever unpredictable, tested this fragile web. One season, a storm swept across the waters above. Waves churned so fiercely that the currents below became whirlpools, tearing through dwellings and scattering the early markets. Coral walls cracked. Kelp clearings were ripped apart, and for a moment, it seemed the dream of permanence had been shattered. Families fled back into caves, the glowing jellyfish scattered, and fear returned to the waters. But something remarkable happened. Instead of remaining and hiding, the creatures emerged, together. Crabs carried fragments of broken coral back to the ridge. Turtles returned with stones from far shores to weigh down walls. Fish brought strands of seaweed, weaving them into nets strong enough to hold against future tides, and jellyfish, gathering in clusters, filled the waters with their steady glow as though declaring, "We will not be driven apart again." That storm, destructive though it was, marked a turning point. It was the first great trial of the community, and by surviving it together, they proved that their bonds were stronger than chaos. In the silence after the storm, the reef looked different, not because of destruction, but because of rebuilding. Walls were sturdier, paths clearer, markets more carefully placed. What had been fragile now had the beginnings of resilience. From that day on, the reef dwellers began to think of themselves less as scattered groups and more as one people, bound by the tides and by each other. They were not just citizens of the sea, they were citizens of a place. This sense of place grew stronger with the creation of shared spaces. No longer content with only markets or dwellings, the creatures began to build areas meant for everyone. A wide sandy basin became a gathering ground where festivals and disputes alike were held. A ring of tall kelp was woven to a sanctuary, a living monument to the myths of old. And in the very center of the reef, a natural rock outcrop was cleared and smoothed until it became something akin to a plaza, a heart for the community, where jellyfish lights glowed brightest at night. At these shared spaces, new traditions blossomed. Festivals no longer honored only the great heroes, but also the resilience of the people themselves. They celebrated the harvest of kelp, the survival of storms, the building of new homes. Music began to echo through the waters, fish humming in currents, crabs clicking in rhythm, jellyfish pulsing with light. These were no longer just rituals of survival or reverence. They were expressions of joy, belonging, and creativity. And with joy came curiosity. The children of this new community grew up not fearing the vastness of the sea, but marveling at its possibilities. They swam beyond the reef, not as wanderers, but as explorers, always returning with shells, stones, or stories from beyond. The town, though not yet called one, was no longer a fragile experiment. It was becoming a way of life, passed down from one generation to the next. Yet beneath this transformation lay something even more profound: identity. For the first time in their history, the creatures of the sea began to think of themselves not only as individuals or families, but as part of something larger. When asked where they belonged, they no longer answered only with species: crab, fish, jellyfish, turtle. They answered with place. They pointed to the reef, the kelp, the sandy basin, the glowing plaza, and said, "Here, this is home." It was in this identity that the true foundations of a town were laid, not in coral walls or kelp paths, but in the invisible bonds of belonging. And as the reef pulsed with life, glowing softly at night with the jellyfish's lanterns, the sea itself seemed to smile. What had once been silence, what had once been legend, was now a living, breathing town in the making. The growth of this reef community was not without questions, for once the idea of home became more than temporary shelter, new challenges naturally arose. Who decided where new dwellings could be built? Who kept the paths clear when kelp grew too thick? Who resolved the disputes when crabs and fish claimed the same hollow, or when jellyfish's glow startled sleeping turtles? At first, these problems were solved informally. Elders stepped forward with calm words, mediating as they had during the age of legends. But as the population swelled, relying only on respected elders became difficult. Conflicts were too frequent, markets too busy, storms too disruptive. The reef was outgrowing old solutions. And so, for the first time, creatures gathered not just to celebrate, but to deliberate. The plaza at the reef's center became more than a place of song and festival. It became a council ground. Creatures of all kinds assembled in concentric rings around the central rock. Here voices rose not in unison, but in debate. Decisions were made not by chance currents, but by consensus. It was a radical shift. The sea had always been a place of flowing freedom, where no one truly ruled another. But in this reef, bonds of belonging meant responsibility. Every citizen had a stake in the safety and harmony of the community. The first councils were clumsy. Arguments stretched on for days, and sometimes no decision was reached at all. But slowly the creatures learned. They found ways to balance their voices, to compromise, to put the needs of the many before the pride of the few. These gatherings gave birth to early customs of governance. A crab elder might oversee disputes of territory. A jellyfish elder might manage the lighting of paths. Turtles, with their wisdom and patience, often acted as mediators when tempers flared. And though imperfect, these structures gave shape to the reef's growing sense of itself as more than a collection of families. It was becoming an organized society. With order came greater prosperity. Markets expanded, not just for survival goods, but for luxuries. Decorative shells, polished by fish, became tokens of trade. Kelp was dyed with natural pigments. turning homes into splashes of color against the reef. Coral walls were carved with patterns, stories etched into their very surfaces. The reef was no longer only practical, it was becoming beautiful. Music and art flourished. The steady rhythms of crab claws inspired dances, while fish created songs carried through currents, their voices harmonizing like choirs of bubbles. Jellyfish, ever luminous, discovered how to pulse in patterns, creating underwater displays of light that enchanted young and old alike. What began as ritual had blossomed into culture, something that gave identity depth beyond survival. Children were the greatest beneficiaries of this transformation. For them, the reef was not a fragile experiment, but the only world they had ever known. They darted through kelp corridors, laughing in the glow of jellyfish lanterns, playing games across coral plazas. Where their parents had once known fear of isolation or storms, these children knew belonging. They grew up with the understanding that they were part of something larger, something enduring. And yet, whispers of unease lingered. For all its order and beauty, the reef was vulnerable. Stories of storms remained in memory, and some elders warned of dangers beyond the community's borders. Giant predators, rogue currents, even human shadows passing above. The reef, they argued, must prepare. Thus began the first experiments in defense. Crabs sharpened coral fragments into tools. Fish practiced swimming in coordinated schools, moving as one to confuse would-be attackers. Turtles reinforced walls not just for storms, but for protection. These efforts were less about waging war and more about ensuring survival, but they marked another turning point. The reef was not just a home, but a place worth defending. This instinct to protect deepened the sense of unity. It was one thing to share markets and music, but another to stand side by side against danger. For the first time, loyalty was not only to family or species, it was to the town itself. The reef had become sacred in a new way, not only because of legends, but because it was built with their own effort, sacrifice, and love. As the seasons passed, the reef's transformation became undeniable. Outsiders, curious travelers from distant waters, began to take notice. Passing schools of fish spoke of a glowing settlement where jellyfish lit the night. Wandering sea creatures rested at the reef, trading stories and goods, marveling at the coral carvings in bustling markets. Some stayed, joining the growing population. The reef was no longer just a home for its founders. It was becoming a beacon, a gathering place where strangers could become neighbors. And yet, with this growth came a new challenge: identity. What did it mean to belong to this reef? Was it enough to live within its walls, or was there something deeper, some shared story or promise that bound them all? These questions lingered, unanswered but pressing, as the reef edged closer to becoming not just a collection of citizens, but a true town, united not only by space, but by spirit. The transformation was nearly complete, though the creatures themselves did not yet realize it. Their markets hummed with trade, their plazas glowed with song, their councils debated late into the night. And above all, their children dreamed. Dreams not of wandering, but of building, of shaping the reef into something grander than any had imagined. The sea, vast and indifferent, continued its endless ebb and flow. But within this small corner, life had found something rare: permanence. The reef, once silent stone and drifting kelp, now throbbed with a heartbeat strong enough to echo across the currents. And though the creatures had no word for it yet, what they were building was clear. This was no longer merely a gathering place. It was becoming something new, something enduring, something future generations would call by a single, powerful word: town. The reef's growth into a town was not a single moment of celebration, nor a sudden declaration. It was rather a gradual unfolding, like the slow bloom of a sea anemone, delicate at first, then confident, until its colors lit the current. Yet, if one looked closely, there were milestones that marked the shift. One such milestone was the construction of what came to be known as the Great Coral Hall. Until then, gatherings had always been held in open plazas, vulnerable to storms, currents, and the unpredictability of the sea. But the citizens desired a place that could weather any season, a structure that reflected the permanence they were beginning to feel in their bones. The hall was carved into a massive coral outcrop near the center of the reef. Builders from every species contributed. Crabs shaped the arches, fish cleared pathways, jellyfish embedded their glow into the walls, and turtles anchored beams of hardened coral to strengthen the foundation. When it was complete, the hall was not only functional but breathtaking. Its vaulted ceilings shimmered with shells pressed into the coral, and bioluminescent designs danced across its surface like stars drawn underwater. Inside, the Great Coral Hall became the heart of the town. Councils met there, deciding on matters that affected everyone. Festivals were held beneath its arches, where music reverberated like waves against stone. When storms struck, families sheltered together within its walls, their voices joined in quiet songs until the waters calmed again. More than any single dwelling or market stall, the hall symbolized what the reef had become. Not just a place where individuals lived, but a shared community with roots deeper than the tides. Alongside the hall came another change: traditions of belonging. To live in the reef was no longer simply to exist within its walls. New citizens who arrived were welcomed through small ceremonies. They were asked to place a polished shell upon the hall's floor, a gift to the community, a promise that they were not only receiving safety, but giving something back. These shells, gathered over seasons, formed a dazzling mosaic across the floor, a living testament to the diversity and commitment of the town. Daily life took on a rhythm that felt new. Markets buzzed in the mornings as creatures traded food, tools, and treasures. Afternoons filled with work on the reef, repairs, expansions, teaching the young, and evenings, when the currents calmed, brought gatherings of song and story. The jellyfish lit the plaza while fish sang ballads of the town's beginnings. Crabs kept steady beats, and turtles added their deep, resonant voices. For those who had lived through the Silent Age, the transformation felt miraculous. For the young, it was simply life, a tapestry of order, beauty, and belonging. Yet even as joy grew, challenges deepened. The reef's popularity attracted not only friends, but opportunists. Strangers sometimes arrived only to take, refusing to contribute, or disrupting the delicate balance of peace. These moments tested the council's wisdom. Rules were written, not harsh laws, but gentle guidelines, agreements about fairness, responsibility, and respect. Though enforcement was rare, the existence of shared rules marked a new level of unity. The reef was no longer bound only by trust, but by a collective agreement, a social fabric woven strong enough to endure strain. It was around this time that the reef earned its first name. Until then, it had been referred to simply as the reef, or the gathering place. But words have power, and the citizens realized that their home deserved an identity, something that would outlast them. They debated for weeks, offering suggestions drawn from legends, from the sea itself, from memories of their ancestors. Finally, they chose a name that meant both shelter and light in the old tongue of the sea. Though the true word is lost to time, in the stories it has been carried forward as the forerunner of what we now know as Bikini Bottom. The naming ceremony was unlike anything seen before. Every citizen gathered at the plaza, shells in hand, and released them into the currents. The shells swirled together, glinting like stars beneath the sea before settling into patterns across the sand. As the name was spoken aloud for the first time, a hush fell, and then, slowly voices rose, not in debate or dispute, but in one harmonious chant. The reef, now a town, had claimed its soul. From then on, the reef carried itself differently. Outsiders spoke of it not only as a settlement, but as a place with an identity, a character, a destiny. Its citizens held their heads a little higher, their shells a little brighter. They were not merely survivors of storms or wanderers of the sea. They were townsfolk, members of something larger, stewards of a legacy that stretched from the silent beginning to the living present. Time, of course, continued to flow as it always does. New challenges would arise, new legends would be born, and future generations would reinterpret the meaning of the town they inherited. But the foundation laid in this era, the transformation from scattered dwellings into a united town, was indelible. It was here that the heart of Bikini Bottom first began to beat, strong and steady, echoing through the centuries to come. And so the reef that had once been nothing more than coral and shadow became something extraordinary, a town, a beacon, a home. Its story was not finished, it was only just beginning, but from this point onward, everything would be different. The ocean remained vast, wild, and unpredictable. But within it, beneath the waves, in the glow of jellyfish and the rhythm of crab drums, a miracle had occurred. Life had not only survived, it had chosen to gather, to build, to create, to belong. And in that choice, a town was born. The ocean never truly sleeps. Its tides shift with the moon, its currents wander endlessly, and its creatures stir in hidden caverns long after the reef grows quiet. Yet if one listens closely, in the still hours when the sea hushes into a lull, there is something deeper than movement, a kind of dreaming. It is said by the elders of Bikini Bottom that the ocean itself remembers, not in words or records, but in waves and echoes, in the rhythm of water flowing through coral and sand. Every storm leaves a trace. Every birth, every song, every sorrow drifts into its depths and becomes part of an eternal memory. Just as a shell holds the sound of the sea holds the sound of life. And so, when the town settled into itself, its markets calm, its plazas quiet, its lantern lights dimming one by one, the ocean carried on with its quiet dreaming. It dreamed of the beginning, when there was only silence and dark. It dreamed of the first citizens, the builders, the legends, and it dreamed of what was still to come, stories not yet lived, lives not yet imagined. Some nights, those who lingered at the edges of the reef swore they could hear the dreams. They told of strange melodies rising from the deep, as though the sea itself was humming. Sometimes shapes of light drifted through the water, soft glows like constellations swimming in the current. Fish would pause, their fins stilled, just to watch. Crabs would lift their claws in reverence. Even the ever-busy plankton slowed their dance, all of them listening, all of them wondering. Was this the ocean remembering? Or was it the ocean whispering a dream of what could be? The people of Bikini Bottom began to weave these mysteries into their own lives. Parents told their children that when they closed their eyes, the ocean dreamed alongside them, carrying their thoughts into the wide sea. Young lovers sat at the edge of coral cliffs, sharing secrets with the current, believing the water would keep them safe until time carried them back again. Elders near the ends of their lives found comfort in the idea that their voices would not fade, but dissolve into the great dreaming tide. The ocean's dream became more than a belief. It became a rhythm. Citizens moved with gentler steps, as though not to disturb the dreaming waters. Builders carved their coral homes in flowing shapes that mirrored waves, honoring the dream's constant motion. Musicians tuned their instruments not only to entertain, but to echo the sea's low hum. The reef was alive, yes, but it was also part of something greater, a single note in an infinite song. And yet the dreams were not always gentle. Just as the sea could turn from calm to storm, so too did its dreaming sometimes bring shadows. Whispers of ancient battles flickered through the currents. Rumors of forgotten creatures stirred fear. Now and then citizens woke from strange dreams, claiming to have seen cities long gone or creatures unlike any known in their waters. These visions were rare, but they reminded the town that the ocean's memory was vast, and not all of it was soft. Still, rather than fear, the citizens chose reverence. They saw the ocean's darker dreams as warnings, gentle nudges to remember humility. For though the reef was their home, it was still only a small part of a boundless world. The town learned to respect what they did not understand, to listen with care, and to carry forward only what brought peace. Over time, the phrase, "the ocean still dreams," became a saying spoken at the end of gatherings. When families parted ways after festivals, they would murmur it softly, like a blessing. Merchants closing their stalls whispered it as a hope for tomorrow's fortune. Even the council ended their meetings with those words, acknowledging that no decision was ever truly final, for the sea itself was always imagining new paths. It was a phrase that carried both comfort and mystery. Comfort because it meant that life was never stagnant, that the waters were always moving, always alive. Mystery because no one could say what the ocean dreamed of next. Perhaps a brighter future, perhaps challenges yet unseen, perhaps something no creature could yet imagine. In this way, the reef lived in harmony not only with itself, but with the endless dreaming of the deep. Each citizen, in their own way, became a dreamer too, adding their stories, their songs, their silences to the great current that carried all things forward. And so, as the lights dimmed each night and the currents slowed to their gentle sway, the town would rest. Above, the moon traced its silver light through the waves. Below, the reef glowed faintly with the soft bioluminescence of jellyfish drifting like lanterns. And around them all, the ocean dreamed on, silent, vast, eternal. As the years passed, the sense of the ocean's dreaming became something almost tangible to the citizens of Bikini Bottom. It was no longer merely a whisper or a superstition. It became the quiet backdrop of daily life, like the steady pulse of the tides themselves. Mothers sang lullabies to their children that spoke of waves carrying wishes to the horizon. Fisherfolk, before casting their nets, dipped their claws or fins into the water and closed their eyes, asking the sea to bless the day's work. Even teachers in choral schools reminded their pupils that the lessons they learned were not just for themselves, but contributions to the dream of the ocean, seeds of thoughts that would ripple outward into time itself. The idea that the sea carried all memory gave the citizens comfort, for it meant nothing was ever lost. A forgotten toy buried in the sand, a melody sung once and never again, a tear shed into the current. All of it belonged to the dreaming tide. To the people of the reef, this meant permanence in a world that otherwise seemed ever-changing. They could live their lives gently, knowing they were part of something infinite. But it also gave rise to stories, stories of what the ocean might be dreaming at that very moment. Some whispered that the sea was dreaming of distant lands, places far beyond their reef where currents flowed into strange oceans filled with creatures never seen before. Others said the sea dreamed of the stars, imagining itself as the sky, and wondering what it might be like to float among constellations rather than coral. There was even a tale told among the younger citizens that the ocean dreamed of them as characters in its own story, that perhaps they were nothing more than images drifting through the imagination of water. When children shared this idea with their parents, they were not scolded for silliness. Instead, parents smiled softly and said, "And if that were true, what a gentle dream we must be." The power of these beliefs was not only spiritual, it was practical too. Disputes in the town were often softened by the reminder that the ocean was listening. Citizens reminded one another that every harsh word or careless act would become part of the sea's dream. Who would want to contribute bitterness to such a beautiful current? And so the thought of the ocean dreaming encouraged kindness. Not perfection, of course, for the reef was still full of quarrels, mistakes, and misunderstandings. But even when tempers flared, the phrase, "remember the dream," could calm a heated moment, like cool water poured over fire. In the quiet evenings, when the lanterns flickered low and the bustle of the market faded, the ocean's dreaming felt strongest. The streets would grow silent except for the faint swish of water flowing between buildings, like a heartbeat that held the whole town. Citizens moved slowly, savoring the stillness. Some would wander to the edge of the reef, looking out toward the shadowy expanse where their town faded into endless blue. They knew they could not see the ocean's dream with their eyes, but they felt it. Vast, cradling, eternal. Scribes and storytellers began to collect tales of these nightly feelings. They wrote of shimmering visions glimpsed in the water, of voices heard in the silence. One poet described the sea's dreaming as a quilt of memories stitched together by moonlight. Another called it a library of lives, written not on pages, but in ripples and tides. These descriptions did not attempt to explain the mystery, but to honor it, to make it part of the cultural tapestry of Bikini Bottom. And the ocean seemed to answer. For on nights of the full moon, when the currents shimmered brightest, strange wonders appeared. Schools of glowing fish would move in intricate patterns, almost like letters written across the sea. Whales far beyond the reef sang low, echoing notes that vibrated through coral and stone. Sometimes, without warning, a soft current swept through the reef, carrying sand in swirling shapes that looked like spirals, stars, or even eyes. The people did not question these marvels. They accepted them as glimpses of the dream itself, moments when the sea allowed them to see a fraction of its endless memory. There were skeptics, of course. Not everyone believed the sea could dream. Some argued that what others called visions were nothing more than coincidences of tide and moon. They said the ocean was vast, yes, but it was only water, current, and salt, not a living dreamer. And yet even those skeptics, when they sat alone at night listening to the hush of the waves, found themselves pausing, wondering. For the truth was simple. Belief in the ocean's dream was less about proof and more about comfort. It was about living with gentleness, about seeing oneself as part of something greater. Whether or not the sea truly dreamed, the people found meaning in imagining it did. And so the legend endured, flowing as steadily as the tide. Thus, Bikini Bottom was not only a town built of coral and stone, but a town built of dreams. The walls of its homes hummed with old songs. Its streets held the weight of countless stories, and every citizen, knowingly or not, walked with the rhythm of the ocean's dreaming heart. As generations passed, the dream of the ocean began to weave itself into the very rhythm of Bikini Bottom's growth. Buildings rose taller, streets stretched wider, and yet the sense of connection to the sea's slumbering heart never dimmed. In fact, the more the town grew, the more its people seemed to need the reminder of the dream, like a lighthouse guiding them back when life became too hurried. Elders often remarked that a community without stories was like a reef without coral, bare, fragile, and empty. The stories of the ocean's dream ensured that no citizen felt alone, no matter how small or unnoticed their life seemed. Even the humblest acts were thought to ripple outward into the grand narrative, a baker's laugh while kneading dough, the way a child scrawled shapes in the sand, a neighbor sharing kelp tea with another on a cold current night. All of it, they believed, became threads in the ocean's great dream quilt. This gave rise to a new tradition, the dream festivals. Once a year, during the quietest tides of the season, the people of Bikini Bottom gathered along the reef's edge. Each family carried a lantern made of coral glass and glowing algae. Together, they released these lanterns into the water, watching as they floated slowly away, scattering into the dark like drifting stars. As they did, they whispered wishes, not for themselves alone, but for the dream of the sea. Some wished for peace across the reef, some for safety for travelers on distant currents, some for forgotten souls whose stories might otherwise vanish. The sight was breathtaking. Hundreds of glowing lanterns spreading into the deep, each one carrying a fragment of hope. To the people, it was not just ceremony, it was communion. They believed the ocean gathered those whispers into its memory, tucking them into the dream where they would live forever. Children, of course, were the most enchanted by the dream festivals. They giggled as they crafted lanterns with clumsy fins or claws, painting them with shells and bits of driftwood. Their laughter carried over the water as their creations bobbed away into the night. Parents told them, "The ocean remembers every lantern. Someday, it may dream it back to you." And this thought stayed with them into adulthood, a reminder that the sea's memory was vast and kind. But even beyond the festivals, citizens felt the ocean's dreaming presence in daily life. Fishermen swore that certain shoals of fish returned year after year not by instinct alone, but because the ocean remembered their paths. Gardeners believed that kelp grew taller if one sang gently to it, as though the plants themselves were tuned to the dream. Musicians played softer notes in the evenings, convinced that melodies lingered in the currents long after the sound faded. There were also stories of those who claimed to have touched the dream directly. These were rare individuals, quiet, thoughtful, often solitary, who described moments of deep stillness when the world around them dissolved, and they felt as though they were floating within the very imagination of the sea. One hermit crab wrote in a worn journal that he had once seen visions of distant reefs, glowing cities beneath strange moons, and creatures so vast their shadows covered miles. He insisted these were not hallucinations, but fragments of the ocean's dreaming, glimpses of places real and yet unseen by ordinary eyes. Whether these claims were true or not mattered little. The people cherished such tales not as facts but as poetry, proof that the mystery of the ocean's heart remained alive, forever inviting wonder. And as much as the dream comforted them, it also taught humility. For if every word, every action, and every memory flowed into the ocean's dream, then no one could ever fully grasp the entirety of what they were part of. The sea's dream was larger than any mind could hold. Citizens often reminded themselves, "We are drops in an endless tide." This thought was not frightening, it was freeing. To be a drop in such vastness was to belong, to be carried, to know that even the smallest ripple mattered. In this way, life in Bikini Bottom became a balance, a bustling little town with markets and laughter, but also a sacred quietude beneath it all, no matter how much progress came, no matter how many inventions or trades filled the streets. The undercurrent of the dream remained steady. It was the lullaby that rocked the town, the breath beneath every tide, the eternal listener in the dark. And so when nights grew long and sleep heavy, the citizens often whispered their final thought of the day into the water beside their beds. It was a simple gesture, a gentle acknowledgement. "Here, ocean, take this thought. Dream it with me." Then they would drift into slumber, trusting that their dreams and the ocean's dreams mingled somewhere in the deep, flowing together like two currents, joining into one. In the quietest moments, when the town hushed itself into slumber, one could almost hear the ocean's dreaming as a low hum beneath the silence. It wasn't a sound of waves or currents, but something softer, like a heartbeat, deep and ancient. Some said it was the ocean remembering. Others believed it was the ocean waiting, keeping watch over those who slept in its care. Night after night, this steady presence reminded the people that they were never alone. For while a single citizen might fade into time, their essence, the laughter, the worries, the songs, the tears, was thought to ripple forever in the dream. To the community, this meant that nothing was ever truly lost. Even those who had passed long ago lived on in the ocean's quiet imagination, stirring gently like leaves caught in a current. And so, in moments of grief, the dream became a comfort. When families mourned, they whispered their sorrow into seashells, then returned those shells to the water. They believed the ocean would hear, carry the sorrow away, and soften it, turning pain into memory, and memory into love. Many citizens felt lighter after this ritual, as though the ocean itself had taken part of their burden. The dream was not only about memory, it was also about renewal. The people noticed that life moved in cycles, tides of beginning and ending that mirrored the sea itself. A reef might crumble, yet from its stones would bloom new gardens of coral. A family line might grow quiet for a generation, only to resurface in the laughter of a child with the same smile as an ancestor. To the people, these were not coincidences, but the ocean redreaming what it wished to keep. Children, naturally curious, often asked questions the elders could not fully answer. Does the ocean dream about us when we're awake? Can it forget things if it wants to? Does the ocean have its own dreams apart from ours? The elders would smile, stroking their whiskers or shells, and reply gently, "Perhaps. But maybe the point's not to know. Maybe the ocean's dream is a mystery, and our role is only to listen." Listening became a practice in itself. Some citizens would sit by the reef at dawn, letting the water flow around them, closing their eyes until they felt their own thoughts quiet. Others listened by watching, tracking how seaweed swayed, how fish darted, how sand shifted with the tides. They believed each movement was part of the ocean's silent speech, a language of patience, of presence. As the town grew more complex, streets paved with shellstone, lamps glowing with gentle bioluminescence, the dream wove itself into architecture too. Builders left spaces open in their designs so that the sea could flow freely through, believing it important that water always touched the foundations of their homes. Market stalls bore carvings of spirals and waves, symbols of endless dreaming. Even the school where children learned their letters had a great mural of the ocean painted across its walls, so that they might remember from their earliest days that knowledge was only one kind of wisdom. The deeper wisdom was listening. With time, new stories joined the old. Legends of ancient builders, tales of forgotten gods, memories of festivals, and whispers of personal dreams all folded into the tapestry of Bikini Bottom's lore. The ocean's dream was not static. It grew and shifted, like sandbanks moved by unseen tides, and yet, at its heart, it always remained the same, a vast, gentle presence that carried everything within it. As one elder once said during a lantern festival, "The dream is the tide we live in. We do not see its beginning or its end, but it carries us all the same." That saying lived on, repeated by parents to children, sung softly as lullabies, etched into stone markers by the reef. It reminded the people that their lives, though brief in the grand scale, were precious because they were part of something infinite. And so when sleep settled each night across Bikini Bottom, there was a sense of shared surrender. Doors closed softly, lights dimmed, the hum of the day faded. Citizens curled into their beds, sponges, crabs, fish, even the smallest plankton, and gave themselves over to slumber. Somewhere in the silence between breaths, they trusted that their dreams would drift outward, carried into the vastness of the ocean's own dreaming. In that union, they found peace. Their town was not just a place on the seafloor, but a living part of the ocean's eternal memory. Each laugh, each song, each lantern, each whispered sorrow, all of it was gathered, cherished, and dreamt into forever. And so the ocean still dreams just as it always has. Dreams of beginnings and endings, dreams of reefs and cities, dreams of citizens who live, love, and return again to the tide. Perhaps even now the ocean dreams of you, listening, resting, drifting into sleep. For in the great expanse of water and memory, there is no separation. The dream is shared. The dream is endless. The dream continues. And as the people of Bikini Bottom sleep tonight, they are carried gently on that dream, like lanterns glowing softly on the current, floating ever deeper into the stillness of the sea,